"Your house is lovely," my son-in-law Bradley announced over the Thanksgiving turkey I had spent 6 hours roasting. He did not look up from his plate. "My parents will take the upstairs master suite. My sister and her 3 kids will take the finished basement. You can move into the small guest room by the laundry. It is your duty to take us in. You have too much space for one old man." I looked at my daughter Rachel, who calmly sipped her wine completely, agreeing with the hostile takeover of my home. I did not scream. I stood up, wiped my mouth with my napkin, smiled, and said one single sentence. "I will have my things packed by morning." The entire room went silent. They thought they had won. They had no idea I was leaving to arm a financial time bomb they themselves had built. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Howard Mitchell, 71 years old and a retired structural engineer. I spent my life building things that were meant to last. Bridges, commercial high-rises, and the very house I was currently sitting in. I built this home for my late wife, Caroline, 30 years ago. It was supposed to be my sanctuary. Instead, it had become a boarding house for ungrateful guests. The Thanksgiving dinner table was heavy with the feast I had prepared from scratch, yet the atmosphere was colder than the November wind rattling the dining room windows. Bradley carved another slice of turkey, his arrogant demeanor completely unshaken by the audacity of his own demands. He had been failing at his logistics startup for 4 years, and I had been quietly funding his lifestyle to keep my daughter happy. Rachel sat beside him, swirling expensive red wine in a crystal glass I had bought for her mother. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Dad, you have to be reasonable," Rachel said, her voice dripping with that patronizing tone she reserved for unruly children. "Bradley's parents lost their lease. His sister is struggling. You rattle around in this massive house all by yourself. It is incredibly selfish to hoard 5 bedrooms when your own family is facing a crisis." I placed my fork down on my antique china plate. The silver clinked loudly in the quiet room. I looked around the table. 4 years of writing checks. 4 years of covering their property taxes when Bradley's brilliant business ideas tanked. 4 years of listening to them mock my outdated lifestyle while actively draining my retirement funds. They did not see me as a father or a respected elder. They saw me as a real estate asset with a pulse. Bradley finally looked up from his meal, wiping grease from his chin. "It makes the most financial sense, Howard. We consolidate resources. We move in, we help you manage your declining years, and you do your part for the family. You take the laundry room. It has a nice window." I stared at the man I had allowed to marry my daughter. He was not asking. He was informing me of an eviction happening under my own roof. The smoldering disrespect I had endured for half a decade was finally catching fire. The sound of a metal tape measure snapping suddenly broke my focus. I turned my head toward the archway leading into my expansive living room. Patricia, Bradley's mother, had already finished her dinner and was actively measuring the bay windows where Caroline's grand piano still stood. She pulled the metal tape across the oak floor, humming a cheerful tune. 84 inches, Patricia called out to her son, completely ignoring my presence. "The beige sectional will fit perfectly once we get rid of that dusty old piano." The piano had not been dusty a day in its life. I polished it every Sunday morning. It was the centerpiece of my home, holding the echoes of Caroline playing classical sonatas on winter evenings. I felt a sharp cold tightening in my chest. Patricia let the tape measure retract with a loud snap. She walked back into the dining room holding a small notebook. "Howard, I hope you do not mind, but I have already contacted a charity to come pick up most of these heavy antique pieces. We prefer a much more modern aesthetic. Mid-century minimalist is very in right now." I looked at Rachel, waiting for her to defend her mother's memory, waiting for her to tell her mother-in-law that the piano was sacred. Rachel just took another sip of wine and nodded. Mom is right, Dad. This place looks like a museum. It needs life. It needs children running around. You have been suffocating in the past for too long. We are actually doing you a favor by bringing some energy back into these walls. The sheer volume of their entitlement was staggering. They were not just taking my space. They were erasing my history. They were systematically dismantling the life I had built piece by piece right in front of my face. Rachel leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table. And let us be honest about your health, Dad. You had that dizzy spell last month. I did not have a dizzy spell. I had stood up too fast after planting 50 tulip bulbs in the front garden. You cannot live alone anymore. Rachel continued, her voice hardening. It is a liability. If you fall down the stairs, no one will be here to find you. Bradley and I are taking on a massive burden by moving everyone here to watch over you. The least you can do is offer the upstairs suites to his parents. They need the comfort more than you do. You just watch television and sleep anyway. The guest room by the laundry is perfectly adequate for your needs. The absolute cruelty of her words hung in the air. The explosive catalyst had just detonated. They were using a momentary lapse in my balance to declare me utterly incompetent and steal my sanctuary. The woman sitting across from me was not the little girl I had taught to ride a bicycle. She was a predator coordinating with her husband to strip mine my life for parts. I realized in that exact moment that fighting them with words would be entirely useless. Screaming about respect would only give them the ammunition they needed to call me unhinged. Crying about Caroline's piano would only make them label me overly emotional and unstable. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to yell so they could justify their hostility. I refused to give them the satisfaction. I took a deep, steadying breath, pulling the oxygen deep into my lungs, and let the cold logic of an engineer take over my mind. I stood up from the head of the table. I did not slam my fists down. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I carefully picked up my cloth napkin, folded it into a neat square, and placed it next to my plate. The dining room fell completely silent. Bradley paused with his wine glass halfway to his mouth. Patricia stopped writing in her little notebook. Rachel watched me with a sudden flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. I looked directly at my daughter and then at her husband. I will have my things packed by morning, I said. My voice was dangerously calm, devoid of any warmth or anger. It was the tone of a man delivering a weather report. Bradley blinked clearly, taken aback by the lack of resistance. Really, he asked, a smug, victorious grin slowly spreading across his face. Well, that is very mature of you, Howard. I am glad we could handle this like adults. I turned my back on them and walked up the grand staircase. I heard the immediate hushed celebratory whispers erupting in the dining room below. I heard Patricia laugh aloud, already discussing paint colors for the master bedroom. I heard the clinking of glasses toasting to their new free real estate. Let them celebrate, I thought. I walked into the master bedroom, the room I had shared with Caroline for decades. I pulled a single leather suitcase from the top shelf of the closet. I did not pack photographs. I did not pack sentimental trinkets. I packed enough clothes for a week, my toiletry bag, and my medication. Everything else was just physical matter. The real value of my life was not in these walls anymore. It was in my mind, my accounts, and my legal rights. I walked down the stairs 30 minutes later. The dinner party had moved to the living room. Bradley was sitting on Caroline's piano bench, resting his expensive leather shoes on the keys. An ugly, discordant noise echoed through the house. Rachel was pointing at the chandeliers, discussing how quickly they could be replaced. Nobody even noticed me walking toward the front door. I did not announce my departure. I simply opened the heavy oak door, stepped out into the crisp November night, and pulled the door shut behind me with a firm, final click. I walked to my car, placed the suitcase in the trunk, and got into the driver's seat. The engine purred to life. I looked back at the house one last time. Every window was blazing with light. They were throwing a victory party in the fortress I had built. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the driveway heading toward the city. I was leaving the battlefield temporarily, but I was not surrendering. I was retreating to higher ground to secure my artillery. I spent the night in a moderately priced motel on the outskirts of the city. The next morning, I drove directly to a luxury high-rise apartment complex downtown. I needed a secure temporary base of operations while I organized my counteroffensive. The leasing agent, a sharp young woman named Sarah, showed me a beautiful studio apartment overlooking the river. It was small, efficient, and completely devoid of memories. It was exactly what I needed. "I will take it," I told her as we stood in the modern kitchen. "I would like to pay the first 6 months of rent up front plus the security deposit." Sarah smiled warmly. "Excellent choice, Mr. Mitchell. If you follow me to the office, we can process the payment and hand you the keys immediately." I sat across from her polished glass desk and handed over my primary platinum debit card. This account held my liquid emergency funds, an amount I kept readily available for major home repairs or medical issues. It was an account I had opened jointly with Rachel 5 years ago, shortly after Caroline passed away. Rachel had convinced me that she needed access in case I was ever incapacitated in a hospital, and she needed to pay my medical bills quickly. I had trusted my daughter. I had believed her intentions were rooted in care. Sarah swiped the card through the terminal on her desk. She typed in the total amount, smiled at me, and waited. A sharp beep echoed in the small office. Sarah frowned slightly, looking at her computer screen. "I am sorry, Mr. Mitchell, but the transaction was declined." I raised an eyebrow. "That is impossible. Please try it again. The machine might be acting up." She swiped it a second time. The same sharp rejection beep filled the room. She looked up at me with sympathetic eyes. "It is declining with an insufficient funds error, sir. Do you perhaps have a daily spending limit on this specific card?" A cold, heavy stone dropped into the bottom of my stomach. There was no spending limit on that account. There was over $90,000 sitting in that specific checking account as of last Tuesday. I politely asked Sarah to excuse me for a moment and stepped out into the quiet hallway. I pulled out my smartphone, opened my banking application, and logged into the joint account. The screen loaded. The available balance stared back at me in bold black numbers. $412. I stopped breathing for a second. I clicked on the transaction history. There was a single massive outbound wire transfer initiated at 2 o'clock that morning, just hours after I had walked out of the house. $85,000 had been moved to a private account under Bradley Vaughn's name. The memo line on the transfer simply read, "Home renovations and furniture." I leaned against the cool painted wall of the hallway. Rachel had not just kicked me out of my house. The moment I walked out the door, she had logged into our joint emergency account and drained my liquid savings to buy luxury furniture for her in-laws. She had stolen the cash I needed to survive. She knew I was leaving to find an apartment, and she had intentionally crippled my ability to pay for a place to sleep. She was actively trying to force me onto the streets, so I would have no choice but to crawl back to the house and accept living in the laundry room as a dependent. The immediate consequence of my silent departure had escalated into outright financial theft. They were not just taking my space anymore. They were taking my resources. They had forced my hand. I walked back into the leasing office, handed Sarah a different credit card from an entirely separate financial institution, and secured the apartment. Once the paperwork was signed, I walked out to my car and sat in the driver's seat. I did not start the engine immediately. I placed my hands on the leather steering wheel and stared straight ahead through the windshield. I was a structural engineer for 40 years. My entire career was dedicated to understanding how immense weight is distributed, how stress fractures form under pressure, and how buildings remain standing during catastrophic events. I understood load-bearing walls. I understood foundations. Most importantly, I understood how to bring a massive structure down safely and completely. You do not hit the roof with a hammer. You do not chip away at the drywall. If you want to collapse a towering structure, you locate the critical stress points in the foundation and you systematically remove them. Gravity does the rest of the work for you. Rachel and Bradley believed they had just built an impregnable fortress using my money and my property. They felt powerful. They felt secure. But they were amateurs playing a dangerous game with a master builder. They had built their new life on a foundation that I legally owned. I pulled my phone out again and looked at the depleted bank account. The $85,000 was gone, but the account history remained. The digital footprint was permanent. Rachel thought being a joint signer gave her the right to empty the account, but she had fundamentally misunderstood the legal boundaries of fiduciary responsibility. I did not call her to scream. I did not send a threatening text message. Emotional outbursts are the tools of the weak. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I pulled out of the parking lot and merged onto the highway, heading directly toward the main branch of my bank. I was going to demand a full forensic audit of every single asset attached to my name. I was going to locate every single crack in their stolen foundation, and then I was going to pull the support columns out from under their feet. I drove my car into the pristine parking lot of the First National Bank building downtown. The morning sun reflected sharply off the glass exterior, casting long shadows across the pavement. I walked through the heavy revolving doors with the steady, measured pace I had used to walk construction sites for 40 years. I did not look like a victim. I did not shuffle or look down at my feet. I wore my best tailored charcoal suit and carried a thick leather briefcase that held decades of meticulous financial records. The lobby was quiet, filled with the soft hum of air conditioning and the faint clicking of computer keyboards. I approached the reception desk and asked to speak directly with the senior branch manager, Matthew Campbell. I had known Matthew for over 15 years. He had personally handled the corporate accounts for my engineering firm before I retired. The young receptionist asked if I had an appointment. I told her I did not need one today. My tone left absolutely no room for negotiation. Matthew stepped out of his glass-walled office a few minutes later, extending a warm hand. "Howard, it is always a pleasure," he said, completely unaware of the storm I had brought to his doorstep. "Come in, have a seat. Can I get you a coffee or some water?" I declined the offer. I sat in the firm leather chair opposite his heavy mahogany desk and placed my briefcase carefully on the floor. Matthew sat back, folding his hands, clearly expecting a casual conversation about retirement yields or municipal bonds. I looked at him with absolute clarity. "Matthew, I need you to pull up the joint emergency checking account, ending in 482, I said. My voice was entirely even, giving away nothing of the betrayal burning in my chest. Matthew turned to his monitor, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Of course, Howard. Give me just a second to pull up the system." He clicked his mouse a few times. His eyes scanned the screen, and I watched his posture suddenly change. The relaxed, friendly demeanor vanished instantly. He leaned closer to the monitor, a deep frown forming on his face. "Howard," he started, his voice suddenly thick with hesitation. "There was a very large outbound wire transfer processed early this morning. $85,000 was moved to an external account." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes locked on his. "I am aware," I told him. "It was transferred to my son-in-law, Bradley Vaughn. The authorization was executed by my daughter, Rachel." Matthew exhaled a loud sigh of relief, leaning back in his chair and offering a weak smile. "Oh, thank goodness. I was worried we had a case of elder exploitation or identity theft on our hands. Since Rachel is a joint account holder on that specific file, the transfer is perfectly legal. Is there a problem with the routing number or the destination bank?" He expected me to be confused. He expected me to be a forgetful senior citizen trying to track a routine family expense. I did not raise my voice. I did not complain about Rachel stealing my money to buy luxury furniture. I leaned forward, resting my forearms heavily on his desk. "The transfer is legally binding, Matthew," I said quietly. "But it was entirely unauthorized by me. My daughter has emptied my liquid life savings without my consent." Matthew froze. The color drained from his face as the reality of the situation set in. He stammered, trying to find the right legally compliant words. "Howard, I am so sorry, but as a joint signer, she has equal rights to those funds under the law. There is absolutely nothing the bank can do to reverse a cleared wire transfer authorized by a valid account holder. If you want to dispute this, it becomes a civil matter. You would have to take your own daughter to court." "I know exactly how the law works," I replied calmly. "I did not come here to ask you to reverse the wire. I came here to close that specific account, immediately removing any remaining access Rachel might have to the remaining $400. But more importantly, I came here to inspect the entire foundation." Matthew looked thoroughly confused. "The foundation," he repeated. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a fresh legal pad and a silver pen. "I am a structural engineer, Matthew. When a crack appears in a load-bearing wall, you do not just patch the drywall and walk away hoping it holds. You excavate the entire site. You check every steel beam, every concrete joint, and every hidden footing. Rachel stealing my emergency fund is a massive structural crack. I need to know how deep the rot goes before the roof collapses on my head." I placed the legal pad on his desk. "I am formally requesting a full comprehensive forensic audit of every single financial instrument attached to my Social Security number," I instructed. "I want to see every checking account, every savings account, my retirement portfolios, and my investment trusts. I want a hard copy of every transaction, every withdrawal, and every single signature made over the last 12 months. If Rachel felt comfortable draining my liquid cash overnight to fund her husband, I need to know what else she has been doing while I was trusting her." Matthew swallowed hard, realizing the immense gravity of the situation. This was not an emotional family squabble over a misunderstanding. This was a targeted investigation. Howard, compiling a forensic audit of that magnitude will take several hours. We have to pull archived records from different corporate departments. I have nowhere else to be, I told him. I crossed my legs and leaned back in my chair, projecting absolute patience. "I will sit right here in this office until you print every single page." Matthew nodded nervously. He picked up his desk phone and began making urgent calls to the fraud department and the wealth management division. For the next 2 hours, the glass office became a silent war room. Junior bankers walked in and out, handing Matthew thick stacks of freshly printed paper. I sat in perfect silence, watching the pile of documents grow higher and higher. I did not feel sorrow anymore. I did not feel the sting of a father's betrayal. I only felt the cold, sharp focus of a man analyzing a catastrophic structural failure. I was entirely detached from the emotion of losing my daughter, focusing entirely on the mathematics of my survival. Finally, Matthew arranged the massive stack of papers into neat categorized folders. He took a deep breath, looking physically exhausted by the process. "All right, Howard, we have everything right here. Your primary retirement accounts are fully intact. The offshore trusts you set up decades ago remain entirely secure and untouched. However, as I was reviewing the property records linked to your primary residence, I found something highly irregular." Matthew paused, taking off his wire-rimmed glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked at me with genuine dread in his eyes. He clearly did not want to deliver the next piece of news. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically, growing cold and suffocating. "What did you find, Matthew?" asked my voice, remaining perfectly level despite the sudden drop in my stomach. Matthew pushed a separate, bright red folder across the desk. It landed right in front of me with a heavy thud. "Howard," he said softly, "you own your home outright. Or at least you did until 3 months ago." I stared at the bright red folder sitting perfectly square in the center of the mahogany desk. Matthew did not reach out to open it for me. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, his knuckles completely white. The silence in the office was deafening, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning vent above us. I slowly reached out and flipped the thick cardboard cover open. The first document was a standard bank form, but the bold black letters at the very top made my vision blur for a fraction of a second. It was a home equity line of credit agreement, a massive loan secured directly against the deed of my house. I scanned down to the principal amount, $400,000. I read the number again, making sure my eyes were not deceiving me. 400,000. It was a staggering sum of money. My house was entirely paid off. Carolyn and I had made the final mortgage payment 15 years ago. It was our proudest financial achievement. Now looking at this piece of paper, my debt-free sanctuary had a $400,000 anchor chained to its front door. I looked up at Matthew. My voice was dangerously quiet. Explain this to me right now, Matthew. Explain how a loan of this magnitude was attached to my property without my physical presence in this bank. Matthew swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. 3 months ago, Rachel came into the branch. He began, his voice trembling slightly. She had the original deed to the house. She also had a comprehensive power of attorney document fully notarized, granting her complete financial control over your estate. She claimed you were beginning to suffer from severe cognitive decline and that you had authorized her to leverage the equity in the house to generate liquid cash for your future medical care. I felt a cold rage spreading through my chest. A power of attorney. She had forged a legal document declaring me mentally incompetent. I looked back down at the loan agreement. On the final page, right on the borrower signature line, was my name, Howard Mitchell. But it was not my handwriting. The loops were too loose. The pressure of the pen was entirely wrong. It was a very careful, very deliberate forgery. Rachel had practiced my signature. My own daughter had sat somewhere, perhaps at the very dining room table I built, and practiced stealing my identity until she perfected it. She knew I kept the original deed in the fireproof safe in the basement. She knew the combination, because I had given it to her years ago in case of an emergency. She had used every ounce of trust I ever gave her to orchestrate a massive financial crime. Where did the money go? I asked, tracing the forged signature with my index finger. Matthew typed frantically on his keyboard, pulling up the disbursement records. The entire $400,000 was drawn down in a single lump sum 48 hours after the loan was approved. It was wired directly into the corporate operating account for Vanguard Logistics. That was Bradley's company, the failing startup that had been bleeding money for 4 years. The $85,000 Rachel stole this morning was just petty cash. It was pocket change meant to buy luxury couches and dining tables for her in-laws. The real theft had happened 90 days ago. They had secretly mortgaged my entire life's work to bail out a sinking business. They had injected $400,000 of my equity into a black hole of debt, hoping Bradley could miraculously turn his company around before I ever noticed the missing money. But that was not the worst part. Matthew pushed a secondary document across the desk. It was a payment schedule. Howard, he said, his tone shifting from apologetic to deeply urgent. This line of credit was structured with a short-term high-interest introductory period. Because of the sheer size of the draw and the lack of any corresponding incoming deposits to offset the balance, the introductory grace period is expiring. The first massive installment payment is due in exactly 30 days. The amount due is $15,000, and it will be $15,000 every single month after that. I stared at the payment schedule. $15,000 a month. My pension and Social Security combined barely covered a third of that amount. Rachel knew my exact income. She knew I could never afford those monthly payments. She never intended to pay it back. I realized the true depth of her cruelty in that exact moment. Moving her extended family into my house was not just an act of entitlement. It was a calculated occupation. She knew the bank would eventually come looking for their money. She knew the house would go into foreclosure the moment the payments bounced. She and Bradley were planning to live rent-free in my luxury home for the next year, while the bank slowly navigated the lengthy legal foreclosure process. They were going to milk my property for every day of free shelter they could get, completely destroying my credit and my legacy in the process. When the sheriff finally arrived to lock the doors, they would simply pack up and leave, leaving me bankrupt and homeless at 71 years old. The sheer audacity of the plan was breathtaking. As a structural engineer, I had seen buildings collapse because of bad materials or poor design. But this was different. This was intentional sabotage. My daughter had packed dynamite into the foundation of my life and lit the fuse. And the fuse was exactly 30 days long. In 30 days, the bank would declare the loan in default. The foreclosure notices would hit the public record. The life I built with Caroline would be auctioned off on the courthouse steps to satisfy a debt I never agreed to. Matthew watched my face closely, terrified of my reaction. "Howard, this is textbook wire fraud and forgery," he said urgently. "We need to involve the authorities immediately. I have a direct contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation who handles financial crimes. If we report this right now, we can freeze the logistics company accounts. We can prove the power of attorney was falsified. Rachel will be arrested by the end of the week." He was desperate to protect the bank from the massive liability of having approved a fraudulent $400,000 loan. He wanted the police to fix the problem. I slowly closed the red folder. I placed my hands flat on the desk. "No, Matthew," I said, my voice as cold and hard as cured concrete. "We are not calling the police. We are not calling the federal authorities." Matthew looked at me as if I had lost my mind. "Howard, you are facing imminent foreclosure. They stole $500,000 from you. You have to press charges." I looked him dead in the eye. If I call the police today, Rachel gets arrested. She hires a criminal defense attorney using the $85,000 she stole from me this morning. The court process drags on for years. The loan remains in dispute. The bank still initiates foreclosure proceedings while the criminal trial is pending. Bradley claims he knew nothing about the forgery and paints Rachel as a desperate daughter trying to help her husband. The money in his business account gets tied up in evidence. And meanwhile, his entire extended family continues living in my house, sleeping in my bed, and laughing at my expense. Putting my daughter in handcuffs does not solve my problem. It does not get my house back. And it certainly does not punish Bradley for orchestrating this entire scheme. Matthew leaned back, completely stunned by my cold calculation. "Then what are you going to do, Howard? The first payment is due in 30 days. If it is not paid, the system automatically triggers the default protocol. The machine does not care about family drama. It only cares about the math." "I know exactly what the machine cares about," I replied. I picked up the red folder and slid it into my leather briefcase alongside the rest of the forensic audit documents. I snapped the brass locks shut. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet office. Rachel and Bradley thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they had trapped me under a mountain of debt I could never escape. But they made one catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed I would panic. They assumed I would react emotionally, call the police crying, and beg for mercy. They forgot that I spent 40 years designing structures meant to withstand immense crushing pressure. They gave me 30 days. That is more than enough time to build a trap of my own. I stood up from the chair, picked up my briefcase, and looked at Matthew one last time. "I need certified copies of everything you gave me today, complete with the bank seal. I am going to see my attorney." I left the bank and drove straight to the law offices of Vincent Cole. Vincent was not just my attorney. He was a man I had known since he was a young associate fresh out of law school. I had given him his first major corporate contract when I was running my engineering firm. He had built his entire independent practice on the foundation of my early support. Loyalty is a rare commodity in this world, but Vincent had always proven himself to be a man of absolute integrity. I walked into his private suite, bypassing the receptionist with a familiar nod, and stepped directly into his spacious corner office. Vincent looked up from his heavy mahogany desk, surprised by my unannounced arrival. He took one look at my face and immediately closed the laptop in front of him. He knew me well enough to recognize the cold, rigid posture of a man preparing for a major structural collapse. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I sat down in the leather chair opposite him, unlocked my briefcase, and placed the thick stack of bank documents directly on his desk. I slid the certified copy of the forged power of attorney and the $400,000 loan agreement to the very top of the pile. I told him to read it carefully before saying a single word. Vincent put on his reading glasses and picked up the documents. The office was perfectly silent for 10 agonizing minutes. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the pages. I watched the color slowly drain from his face as he absorbed the sheer magnitude of the theft. When he finally reached the last page and saw the forged signature, he took off his glasses and rubbed his temples. He looked visibly sickened. "Howard," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "This is federal wire fraud. This is aggravated identity theft. Your daughter has committed a string of major felonies to funnel $500,000 into her husband's failing business." Vincent stood up and began pacing the length of his office. His protective instincts were kicking in. He reached for his desk phone. "I am calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now," he declared firmly. "I have a contact in the white-collar crime division. We are going to freeze Bradley's corporate accounts before they can spend another dime. We are going to have Rachel arrested for forgery before the sun goes down. She is looking at 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for this level of bank fraud." "Put the phone down, Vincent," I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of the panic or anger he expected. He stopped pacing and looked at me in disbelief. "Howard, you cannot protect her anymore. She crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. She stole your life savings and mortgaged your fully paid house. If you do not report this immediately, you are going to lose everything. The bank will foreclose on your home in 30 days. You will be on the street." I kept my hands resting calmly on the arms of the leather chair. "I am not trying to protect her, Vincent. I am trying to destroy them, but I am going to do it my way." Vincent slowly placed the phone back on the receiver. He sat back down at his desk, staring at me intently. I leaned forward and looked him straight in the eye. "If we call the authorities right now, Rachel goes to jail in handcuffs. But what happens tomorrow? What happens to the money?" Vincent hesitated. "The criminal justice system would eventually order restitution, but the money is likely already spent or tied up in Bradley's corporate debts. You might never see the cash again. The bank would still hold the lien on your house until the court untangled the fraud, which could take years." "Exactly," I said, nodding slowly. "If Rachel goes to prison, Bradley will play the victim. He will stand in front of a judge and swear he had no idea his wife forged the documents. He will claim he thought I willingly invested in his company. He will use the $85,000 Rachel stole this morning to hire a ruthless defense attorney. He will file for divorce to distance himself from her crimes. And while Rachel sits in a jail cell taking all the blame, Bradley and his entire extended family will continue living in my house. They will squat in my home rent-free while the bank spends 3 years trying to foreclose. Throwing my daughter in a cell gives Bradley a free house and a free business bailout." Vincent leaned back, the realization washing over his face. "You want to bypass the criminal system. Jail is entirely too easy," I explained smoothly. "In jail, she gets 3 meals a day and a bed to sleep in. Bradley gets to walk away clean. I do not want them to simply serve time. I want total, inescapable financial ruin. I want Bradley to watch his precious company collapse into bankruptcy. I want his arrogant parents thrown out onto the street with nowhere to go. I want Rachel to realize that her husband will abandon her the second the money dries up. I want them to feel the exact same terror they tried to inflict on me. They thought they could strip mine my legacy to build their own empire. I am going to let them build it, and then I am going to legally repossess the ground underneath it." Vincent stared at me for a long moment. He had worked with me on dozens of complex engineering contracts over the years. He knew how my mind operated. He knew I was no longer speaking as a grieving father. I was speaking as a structural engineer plotting a controlled demolition. He opened a fresh legal pad and clicked his pen. He did not argue with me anymore. He simply nodded his head. "Tell me the blueprint." "Howard," he said softly, "how do we tear their building down?" I smiled for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner. It was a cold, sharp smile. I told him we were not going to run from the $400,000 debt. We were going to own it. I instructed Vincent to pull the files for the offshore technology trust I had established 20 years ago after selling my concrete curing patents. It was a fully funded, entirely untouchable financial vehicle that Rachel knew absolutely nothing about. I told Vincent we were going to use that trust to create an anonymous holding company by the end of the week. "They think they owe the bank," I said quietly, watching Vincent take furious notes. "But by the time the first payment is due, they are going to owe me." I sat across from Vincent and watched him pull up a secure encrypted server on his laptop. I told him to look for a file named Obsidian. It was a file he had not opened in nearly 2 decades. 20 years ago, I invented a specialized polymer additive for curing high-density concrete in sub-zero temperatures. It was a highly specific engineering problem, but it revolutionized winter construction projects across the entire Northern Hemisphere. I sold the primary manufacturing patent to a massive international conglomerate, but I retained a small fraction of the global royalty rights. I never told Rachel about the money. I never even told Caroline the full extent of the wealth it generated over the years. I funneled every single penny of those royalties into a blind offshore trust registered in the Cayman Islands. It was my ultimate structural fail-safe designed to remain entirely invisible to the American tax system and completely insulated from any domestic civil lawsuits. I had always planned to quietly donate the entire sum to a university engineering scholarship fund after I passed away. I wanted it to build futures for kids who actually worked hard. Now that invisible financial fortress was going to fund my counterattack against my own flesh and blood. Vincent authenticated the server connection and accessed the trust records. He stared at the balance on the screen, his eyes widening slightly. The amount sitting in that offshore account was more than enough to execute our strategy 10 times over. I told Vincent to immediately draft the incorporation documents for a new limited liability company based in Delaware. Delaware corporate laws offer absolute anonymity for executive officers and shareholders, making it legally impossible for anyone to trace the ownership. Back to me. We needed a name that sounded like a faceless, aggressive corporate debt collection firm. We settled on Apex Financial Acquisitions. I authorized the immediate wire transfer of $1 million from the offshore trust into the newly formed corporate bank accounts for Apex Financial. Vincent worked with a quiet, ruthless efficiency. He made 3 phone calls to his private network of corporate fixers. Within 48 hours, Apex Financial Acquisitions was a fully registered, legally binding entity with a corporate bank account and a registered agent address in Wilmington. Rachel and Bradley were completely unaware that a massive financial predator had just been born in the shadows, and it was entirely focused on devouring them. The next phase required absolute precision and a deep understanding of corporate psychology. I instructed Vincent to contact Matthew Campbell at the bank directly, but he was not allowed to introduce himself as my friend or my legal representative. Vincent was to contact Matthew acting solely as the executive counsel for Apex Financial Acquisitions. The banking industry is entirely a business of risk management and liability avoidance. Matthew was currently sitting on a $400,000 fraudulent loan that he had personally approved without proper due diligence. He knew that if the loan went into default, The bank would face a massive federal investigation, terrible public relations, and a catastrophic financial loss on their quarterly reports. Banks absolutely despise holding toxic assets on their books, especially when those assets are tied to active federal felonies like wire fraud and identity theft. I told Vincent to offer Matthew a quiet, immediate, and highly lucrative exit strategy. Apex Financial would purchase the entire $400,000 home equity line of credit directly from First National Bank, paying the full principal amount in raw cash. In exchange, the bank would legally transfer the promissory note and the primary lien on my house to Apex Financial. Vincent arranged a private meeting with the bank executives the very next morning. He wore his most expensive suit and presented the offer as a high-risk debt consolidation play by a private equity firm. The bank board was absolutely ecstatic. They did not care why a random Delaware corporation wanted to buy a high-interest residential loan. They only cared that a potentially disastrous fraud case was being wiped completely off their ledgers without a single financial loss. Matthew processed the sale with desperate sweating speed. They drafted the assignment of mortgage documents fully transferring the debt ownership away from the bank. First National Bank received a wire transfer for $400,000 from Apex Financial, and in return, they handed Vincent the original forged promissory note and the absolute legal right to collect the debt. First National Bank was completely out of the equation forever. They washed their hands of the entire messy situation, leaving Bradley and Rachel entirely at the mercy of the new anonymous debt holder. Vincent returned to his office that afternoon, carrying a single heavy manila envelope. He placed it carefully on the desk in front of me. Inside was the legally binding assignment of mortgage officially recorded with the county clerk that very morning. I looked down at the stamped paperwork with a profound sense of cold satisfaction. The trap was now fully armed and permanently locked into place. I had essentially used my own hidden money to buy my own stolen debt. On paper, Rachel and Bradley still firmly believed they owed First National Bank a staggering amount of money. They thought they were dealing with a massive bureaucratic corporation that would take months to notice a missed payment and years to navigate the sluggish legal foreclosure process. They were planning to exploit the slow-moving gears of a banking giant to live rent-free in my house while Bradley tried to save his failing logistics startup. But they did not owe the bank anymore. They owed Apex Financial Acquisitions. And Apex Financial Acquisitions was sitting right here in this leather chair, holding the exact document Rachel had forged. As a structural engineer, I knew that the most dangerous phase of a demolition was the silent period right before the explosives were actually detonated. The charges were set. The wires were connected. Everything looked completely normal from the outside. Bradley was likely sitting in my living room at that very moment, drinking my expensive scotch and congratulating himself on his brilliant business acumen. Rachel was probably browsing online luxury catalogs, planning to buy more modern furniture with the $85,000 she stole from my emergency checking account. Patricia was probably busy redecorating my master bedroom. They all felt utterly invincible inside the sturdy walls I had built with my own two hands. They had no idea that the ground beneath their feet had already been legally sold. They had no idea that their entire financial future was currently resting in a manila envelope on my attorney's desk. The terms of the original loan they forged included a strict acceleration clause. That clause stated that if a single payment was missed, the lender had the right to demand the entire $400,000 balance immediately in full, within 72 hours. I told Vincent to prepare the default notices and draft an emergency commercial eviction order. The first massive $15,000 loan payment was due in exactly 27 days. I knew for a fact they did not have the liquid cash to cover that installment. Bradley's business was bleeding money, and Rachel had already spent a fortune on her in-laws. They were going to default on the very first day. And the absolute second they missed that payment, Apex Financial Acquisitions was going to drop the legal hammer with a speed and ferocity they could never possibly anticipate. We were not going to wait months to file paperwork. We were going to file the default notice the very next morning. I picked up the manila envelope, tucked it securely under my arm, and thanked Vincent for his flawless execution. I walked out of his office building and stepped into the bright afternoon sun. The foundation of their stolen empire was completely rigged. I had removed all the structural supports without them even noticing a single crack in the drywall. All I had to do now was sit quietly in my small studio apartment and wait for the calendar to turn. I was going to let them enjoy their lavish relaunch party. I was going to let them feel like royalty right up until the exact second gravity took hold. 26 days passed in absolute silence. I remained in my small downtown studio apartment, watching the calendar with the patience of a sniper. Vincent and I had everything perfectly positioned. The legal paperwork for the commercial eviction was drafted and sitting in a neat stack on his desk. The notice of default was fully notarized. All we needed was for the clock to strike midnight on the 30th day. I spent my mornings walking along the river and my afternoons reading engineering journals. I did not call Rachel. I did not text Bradley. I let them swim in the delusion of their own success. But arrogance is a very loud emotion. It demands an audience. On the 27th day, I received an email from an old colleague who still lived in my old neighborhood. He forwarded me a digital invitation he had received. It was an incredibly flashy graphic adorned with gold lettering. It announced the grand relaunch of Vanguard Logistics. The venue listed for this massive corporate celebration was my exact home address. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop. Bradley and Rachel were not just living in my house. They were using it as a prop to secure more funding for his failing company. They were throwing a lavish 200-person gala to project an image of immense wealth and stability to potential investors. And they were paying for the catering, the lighting, and the expensive alcohol using the very money they had stolen from my emergency savings account. The sheer audacity of their behavior was almost impressive in its sickness. They were dancing on a floor made of thin ice, completely unaware of the freezing water waiting just inches beneath their feet. I knew I did not need to attend. I knew the trap would spring regardless of whether I was there to witness it. But as a man who spent his life analyzing structures, I felt a deep, undeniable need to inspect the facade one last time before I brought the entire building down. I dressed in a dark wool suit and drove back to my own neighborhood on the night of the party. I parked 3 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance. The crisp night air was heavy with the smell of expensive cologne and roasted meats. As I approached my street, the magnitude of their spending became painfully clear. They had hired a professional valet service to manage the endless line of luxury vehicles clogging the quiet residential road. Massive floodlights bathed the front of my brick colonial home in a harsh artificial glow. A string quartet was playing on the front lawn, their music barely cutting through the loud, overlapping conversations of 200 ambitious guests. I stood on the sidewalk across the street watching the spectacle unfold. I did not feel sad. I felt a cold, clinical detachment. I decided to walk across the street and step onto the property. The security guards at the front gate were busy checking names on a digital tablet, but I did not stop. I walked with the slow, confident authority of a man who owned the ground beneath their feet, and they did not even question my presence. I stepped through the heavy oak front doors and walked into the grand foyer. The interior of the house had been completely stripped of its soul. The warm, inviting colors Caroline had carefully chosen decades ago had been painted over in a sterile, clinical gray. The antique rugs were gone, replaced by cold, polished marble flooring. I looked toward the living room archway. My piano was missing. The bay window area was entirely empty, wiped clean of the music and the memories that had filled this house for 30 years. I moved silently through the crowded rooms, becoming just another face in the sea of expensive suits and cocktail dresses. I found Bradley in the center of the main dining room. He was holding a glass of scotch, surrounded by a tight circle of wealthy local investors. He was speaking loudly, using his hands to emphasize his points. He looked completely at ease, playing the role of the brilliant self-made entrepreneur. I listened as he boasted about his recent capital acquisition, claiming he had successfully navigated a complex corporate buyout to secure $500,000 in new operating funds. He was openly bragging about the fraudulent home equity line of credit, spinning his federal crime into a story of business genius. The investors nodded along, completely fooled by his expensive clothes and the sheer size of the house he claimed to own. Rachel was standing near the catered buffet, playing the role of the perfect supportive wife. She wore a stunning designer dress that easily cost more than my monthly Social Security check. She was smiling warmly, pouring champagne for the guests, and casually mentioning the extensive renovations she was planning for the kitchen. She looked so natural in her deception. There was no guilt in her eyes. There was no hesitation in her voice. She had completely compartmentalized the fact that she had forged her own father's signature to fund this entire charade. I watched her laugh at a joke someone made, and the last remaining shred of paternal instinct I held for her completely evaporated. She was not a victim of her husband's ambition. She was the architect of my intended ruin. But the absolute height of their arrogance was not Bradley boasting, nor was it Rachel pouring champagne. The final crushing insult revealed itself when I walked toward the back patio. The glass doors were open, letting the cool night air mix with the heat of the party. Standing near the outdoor fire pit was Bradley's mother, Patricia. She was surrounded by a group of women holding court and accepting compliments on the beautiful estate her son had so generously provided for her. I stopped dead in my tracks. My eyes locked onto her neck. Resting against her pale skin was a heavy, intricate emerald necklace set in vintage gold. I felt the air leave my lungs. It was Caroline's necklace. I had bought that exact piece of jewelry in a small antique shop in Paris for our 20th wedding anniversary. Caroline had cherished it. She only wore it on the most special occasions. Before I left the house a month ago, I had made sure that necklace was locked securely in the heavy steel safe hidden in the floor of the master bedroom closet. The only person who knew the combination to that safe was Rachel. Seeing that sacred piece of jewelry wrapped around Patricia's neck meant Rachel had intentionally opened the safe. She had dug through her dead mother's most personal belongings, pulled out the most valuable piece and handed it to her mother-in-law as a party favor. It was a violation so profound that it momentarily broke through my cold exterior. My hands curled into tight fists at my sides. They had not just stolen my money and my house. They were parading around, wearing the physical remnants of my late wife's memory. Patricia reached up and touched the emeralds, casually laughing at something one of the women said. She wore the necklace with the careless entitlement of a scavenger who had stumbled upon a fresh kill. The sheer disrespect was absolute and unforgivable. I stood there in the shadows of the patio, staring at the emeralds glittering in the firelight. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my fists to uncurl. I reminded myself of the timeline. Tonight they were wearing my wife's jewelry and drinking my alcohol. But the 27th day was almost over. In less than 72 hours, the $15,000 payment would be flagged as missed. The illusion was beautiful, but the foundation was completely rigged to blow. I did not need to confront Patricia. I did not need to scream at Rachel or punch Bradley in his arrogant face. I just needed to let them enjoy their final weekend of stolen luxury. I stepped out of the shadows of the patio and walked directly through the open glass doors into the brightly lit living room. I did not try to blend in anymore. I walked with deliberate heavy steps across the polished marble floor, heading straight for the center of the room where Bradley was holding court with his wealthy investors. The low hum of the string quartet seemed to fade as people noticed my approach. I was wearing a dark wool suit, but I did not look like one of them. I looked like a ghost who had come to haunt his own halls. Bradley was mid-sentence, holding his glass of scotch and laughing at his own joke when he finally saw me. His smile completely vanished for a fraction of a second. A flash of genuine panic crossed his eyes because he knew what he had done to me. He knew he had forged my name and stolen my money. For one brief moment, he looked like a terrified child about to be caught. But Bradley was a sociopath disguised as an entrepreneur. He recovered his composure with terrifying speed. His panicked expression morphed into a mask of exaggerated, pitying concern. He stepped away from his investors and walked toward me, holding his hands out, as if he were trying to calm a frightened animal. "Howard," he said, his voice loud enough to ensure everyone in the room could hear him. "What a surprise! We did not expect you to leave your new apartment tonight. Are you lost?" The room grew uncomfortably quiet. 200 people stopped their conversations to watch the drama unfold. I did not answer him. I just stood there, staring directly into his eyes, letting the silence stretch until it became heavy and suffocating. Bradley turned to his investors, offering an apologetic smile. "Gentlemen, please excuse this interruption," he said smoothly. "This is my father-in-law, Howard. He used to own this house before we took over his care. His mind is not quite what it used to be. He gets confused sometimes and wanders back here thinking he still lives here. It is incredibly tragic, really. We had to move him to a specialized facility for his own safety." A collective murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. They looked at me with pity. They saw a frail, dementia-ridden old man who had forgotten his own address. They saw Bradley as a saint, a successful businessman, taking on the heavy burden of caring for his sick relative. Rachel materialized beside him, placing a gentle hand on his arm and looking at me with wide, fake tears in her eyes. "Oh, Dad," she whispered softly, playing her role perfectly. "You should not have taken a taxi all the way out here by yourself. You are going to make yourself sick. You need to be resting." I looked at my daughter. I looked at the extravagant designer dress she had bought with my stolen emergency funds. I looked back at Bradley, who was now motioning to a pair of large men in black suits standing near the front doorway. They were private security guards he had hired for the evening. "Gentlemen," Bradley called out to the guards, his voice dripping with false benevolence. "Could you please help my father-in-law back to his vehicle? He is very confused and needs to be escorted off the property. Please be gentle with him. His bones are brittle." The two massive security guards walked toward me. They flanked me on either side. One of them placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Sir, it is time to leave," the guard said. "We do not want to make a scene." This was the moment they expected me to break. They expected me to scream that I owned the house. They expected me to yell about the forged documents and the stolen money. If I had done that, it would have perfectly validated Bradley's lie. The investors would have seen a crazy old man having a psychotic episode. I would have been dragged out, kicking and screaming, completely humiliated in front of 200 people. But I did not give them the satisfaction. I did not resist the guard's hand on my shoulder. I looked at Bradley. His smug, arrogant face was practically glowing with victory. He thought he had completely neutralized me. He thought he had proven his dominance over my life once and for all. He wanted me to feel utterly powerless. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the absolute chilling smile of a master architect watching a man stand directly under a falling steel beam. I looked at Bradley and said a single sentence. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Bradley." The smile on his face faltered for just a second. He did not understand my calm demeanor. He did not understand why I was not fighting back. He expected rage, but I was giving him absolute compliance. I turned around and walked toward the front door, escorted by the two security guards. The crowd parted for me, whispering as I passed. I walked out the heavy oak doors and down the front steps. The cool November air hit my face, clearing the smell of expensive perfume and catered food from my lungs. The guards walked me all the way down the long driveway, past the line of luxury cars, right to the edge of the public sidewalk. "Have a good night, sir," one of the guards said, completely unaware that he had just kicked the rightful owner off his own land. "Please do not come back tonight." I stepped onto the concrete sidewalk. I turned and looked up at the massive illuminated house. The party was resuming. The string quartet started playing another lively tune. Bradley was probably already back with his investors, laughing about how gracefully he had handled the embarrassing situation. They had just shown me the absolute peak of their cruelty. They had publicly stripped me of my dignity, my sanity, and my home. They had used my own money to hire men to throw me out onto the street. I checked my watch. The 27th day was almost over. They had just thrown their last party. They had just poured their last glass of expensive champagne. They thought they had forcefully removed a confused old man from their property. They had no idea they had just escorted the executioner out of the blast radius. I turned my back on the blinding floodlights of my former sanctuary and began the short walk back to my car. I did not feel humiliated. I felt the profound, quiet peace of knowing that the demolition timer was ticking its final seconds. The hammer was suspended high in the air, and Bradley himself had just cut the rope holding it back. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving them to enjoy the final weekend of their stolen lives. I stepped off the smooth asphalt of my own driveway and felt the rough concrete of the public city sidewalk beneath my shoes. The transition marked the exact boundary between their illusion and my reality. I stood under the pale yellow glow of a street lamp and turned to face the sprawling brick colonial house one last time. The two massive security guards who had escorted me out were already walking back up the driveway, laughing with each other. They thought their job was done. They thought they had successfully protected a wealthy entrepreneur from a confused old man. They had no idea that my exit was the final prerequisite for the demolition to begin. I reached into the inner pocket of my dark wool suit and pulled out my cell phone. I did not need to make a phone call. I simply opened a text message thread with Vincent and typed a single word: execute. Across the street, parked quietly in the shadows between two massive oak trees, was a plain black van. The engine had been running silently for the last hour. The moment I hit send on my phone, the van doors slid open. 4 men stepped out onto the pavement. They were not dressed in expensive suits or flashy security uniforms. They wore plain khaki pants and dark windbreakers. They moved with the synchronized mechanical efficiency of men who delivered bad news for a living. They were elite process servers hired by Vincent specifically for their ability to handle hostile higher-rung corporate environments. I gave a slight nod to the lead server, a tall, broad-shouldered man holding a thick stack of manila envelopes. He did not nod back. He simply adjusted his grip on the documents and began walking purposefully toward the front gates of my property. I stood my ground on the sidewalk, completely safe from the blast radius, and watched the structural supports of Bradley's life begin to buckle. The 4 process servers marched right past the long line of valet-parked luxury vehicles. When they reached the front gate, the 2 security guards who had just thrown me out stepped forward, holding up their hands to block the entrance. The lead server did not even slow down. He pulled a heavy leather wallet from his windbreaker and flashed a silver court-appointed badge directly in the guards' faces. He spoke with a loud, booming authority that echoed down the driveway, stating they were executing a mandatory service of processus from the state Supreme Court. The private security guards immediately stepped aside. They were paid to bounce unruly party guests, not to obstruct active legal officers. The 4 men walked up the wide brick steps and pushed through the heavy oak front doors without knocking. I could see everything perfectly through the massive bay windows where my piano used to sit. The intrusion was immediate and completely disruptive. The string quartet stopped playing in the middle of a chord, leaving a sudden jarring silence in the grand foyer. The loud overlapping chatter of 200 ambitious investors and socialites died down to a confused murmur. The lead server walked directly into the center of the main dining room, ignoring the catered food and the crystal champagne glasses. He scanned the crowd until his eyes locked onto Bradley. Bradley was still standing with his circle of wealthy local investors holding his glass of scotch and looking incredibly annoyed by the interruption. He probably thought the men were disgruntled contractors or confused delivery drivers. He had absolutely no idea that his entire existence was contained within the manila envelopes they were holding. The lead server stepped right up to Bradley. He did not politely ask for a moment of his time. He spoke in a loud, clear voice designed to carry across the entire room, ensuring that every single investor and guest heard every single word. He asked if he was speaking to Bradley Vaughn, Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Logistics. Bradley puffed out his chest, looking around at his investors to show how he handled disruptions. He confidently stated that he was the owner of the house and the company and demanded to know who let them inside. The server did not flinch. He thrust a thick manila envelope directly against Bradley's chest, forcing him to take it or let it fall to the floor. Bradley instinctively grabbed the package, dropping his expensive glass of scotch. The crystal shattered on the polished marble floor, splashing amber liquid across his leather shoes. The server announced that Bradley Vaughn was officially served on behalf of Apex Financial Acquisitions. He stated loudly that the documents contained a notice of immediate default on a $400,000 commercial line of credit. The words cut through the silent room like a razor. The wealthy investors standing next to Bradley physically took a step back, distancing themselves from him, as if he had suddenly contracted a contagious disease. Bradley's face turned the color of ash. He stared down at the envelope, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. The server was not finished. He continued his public declaration, stating that the default was triggered by the discovery of fraudulent loan origination and forged signatures. Because of the criminal nature of the origination, the entire principal balance of $400,000 was due immediately and in full. Rachel pushed her way through the crowd of stunned guests, her designer dress swishing against the floor. She rushed to Bradley's side, her eyes wide with panic, demanding to know what was going on. A second process server immediately stepped into her path and pressed a matching manila envelope into her hands. He announced that Rachel Mitchell Vaughn was also officially served. He stated that in addition to the financial default, the package contained an emergency commercial eviction notice filed by the property lien holder. They were ordered to vacate the premises within 72 hours, or they would be physically removed by the county sheriff department. Rachel dropped the envelope as if it were burning her skin. It hit the marble floor, sliding into the puddle of spilled scotch. She looked around the room at the 200 guests who were now staring at her with wide eyes and open mouths. The perfect, wealthy image she had carefully crafted was dissolving right in front of her. Over by the patio doors, Patricia stood frozen in shock. Her hand was nervously clutching the vintage emerald necklace that belonged to my late wife. The women she had been boasting to moments earlier were now whispering furiously among themselves, pointing at Bradley and Rachel. The humiliation was absolute and comprehensive. Every single person in that house now knew that Bradley was not a successful entrepreneur. He was a fraud who had defaulted on a massive loan and was being evicted from a house he did not even own. The wealthy investors who had been considering giving him their money were already pulling out their phones, texting their legal teams to sever all ties with Vanguard Logistics. The capital he desperately needed to save his failing company was walking out the door. The party guests began moving toward the coat check, keeping their heads down, eager to escape the embarrassing spectacle. The 4 process servers, having completed their legal duty, turned around and walked out of the house, leaving absolute devastation in their wake. They walked back down the long driveway, completely ignoring the chaotic scramble of guests rushing to the valet stand to get their cars. The lead server nodded to me as he passed by on the sidewalk. I nodded back. I watched the floodlights of my house illuminate the mass exodus of Bradley's social circle. The false empire they had built on top of my stolen money had collapsed in less than 5 minutes. They had tried to throw me out into the street to hide their crimes, but instead they had brought the street right into their living room. I knew exactly what was happening inside those walls right now. Bradley was frantically tearing open the manila envelope, trying to find a loophole or a mistake. He was looking at the name Apex Financial Acquisitions and realizing he had no idea who held the debt that was about to destroy his life. He did not know that the anonymous company tearing him apart was fully funded by the old man he had just mocked. He did not know that the architect of his ruin was standing quietly on the sidewalk across the street, watching the dust settle. I turned away from the blinding lights and the sound of panicked voices. The structural integrity of their lies had failed exactly as I designed. Now it was time for them to experience the crushing weight of gravity. I walked down the quiet residential street toward my parked car, leaving them alone in the wreckage of their own arrogant greed. I drove slowly down the quiet streets of my old neighborhood, leaving the chaotic scene behind me. The flashing headlights of the fleeing luxury cars faded into the rearview mirror. I knew exactly what was happening inside my house at that very moment. I did not need to be standing in the room to see the structural collapse. I had designed the demolition. I knew every stage of the implosion. The moment the last party guest rushed out the front door, the heavy oak doors would slam shut, leaving Bradley and Rachel alone in the silent, echoing foyer. The grand illusion of Vanguard Logistics was dead. Bradley was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. He was an opportunist, and opportunists always look for the nearest exit. I knew his first instinct would be to throw money at the problem. He would leave Rachel crying in the hallway and march directly into my old wood-paneled study. He would sit at my heavy mahogany desk, boot up his laptop, and prepare to fight back. Bradley believed he still had a massive safety net. He believed he still controlled the $85,000 Rachel had stolen from my joint checking account on the morning I left. In his arrogant mind, that stolen cash was his emergency war chest. He would plan to transfer a massive retainer fee to the most ruthless corporate defense attorney in the city. He would plan to file emergency injunctions, counterblock the eviction notice, and bury Apex Financial Acquisitions in years of tedious legal paperwork. He thought he could buy his way out of the corner using my own life savings. But a master builder does not just sever the main support columns. He also barricades the emergency exits. I pulled my car into the parking garage of my downtown apartment building and turned off the engine. I pulled my phone from my pocket and looked at a secure text message Vincent had sent me exactly 12 hours earlier. The message contained a single PDF document. It was a judicial order granted by a sympathetic county judge that very morning. Vincent had not just filed the commercial eviction and the notice of default. He had taken the certified forensic audit from First National Bank, proving the forged signature and the unauthorized wire transfer, and he had walked it straight into a private judicial chamber. Based on the overwhelming evidence of active felony wire fraud, the judge had signed an emergency ex parte asset freeze. An ex parte order meant Bradley and Rachel were completely legally blind. They were not notified of the hearing. They were not given a chance to defend themselves. The court had quietly reached into the banking system and thrown a heavy iron padlock onto every single financial account attached to their names, their social security numbers, and the Vanguard Logistics corporate tax identification number. I sat in the quiet darkness of my car, visualizing Bradley sitting at my desk. I could see him furiously typing his password into the banking portal, his hands shaking with residual adrenaline and pure panic. I could see the glow of the laptop screen illuminating his pale, sweating face. He would navigate to the corporate holding account where he had parked my $85,000. He would hastily type in a transfer request for a $50,000 legal retainer. He would click the submit button with a heavy, forceful strike of his index finger, fully expecting the screen to flash a green confirmation message. Instead, the system would pause. The little loading circle would spin on the screen for a few agonizing seconds, and then a bright red error banner would slash across the top of the monitor. The bold white letters would inform him that the transaction could not be completed. The error code would state that the account was frozen pending a severe legal hold. Bradley would not believe it at first. Arrogant men always assume technology is simply malfunctioning before they admit they have been outsmarted. He would refresh the page. He would try a smaller amount. He would try to move $10,000, then $5,000, then 500. Every single attempt would be met with the exact same glaring red wall of text. He would frantically click over to his personal checking account, his savings account, and even Rachel's private credit cards. He would discover that every single digital doorway had been bricked over. The available balance on every screen would read 0. The reality of his situation would finally crush the breath out of his lungs. He was staring at a screen that held $85,000 of stolen cash, but he could not access a single penny of it. It was like dying of thirst while staring through thick, bulletproof glass at a lake of fresh water. He could not hire a defense attorney to fight the eviction. He could not hire a lawyer to dispute the default. He could not even transfer enough money to book a cheap motel room for his evicted parents. Rachel would walk into the study, her expensive designer dress stained with spilled liquor, tears streaming down her face, demanding to know how they were going to fix this disaster. And Bradley, the man who had confidently boasted about his brilliant business acumen just 30 minutes earlier, would have to look at his wife and admit the absolute truth. They had no money to fight. They had no money to run. The trap was completely, perfectly sealed. I stepped out of my car and walked toward the elevator of my apartment building. I felt a profound sense of closure washing over me. The $85,000 they stole from me was the bait, and they had swallowed it whole. By moving that money across state lines into a corporate account, they had handed Vincent the exact jurisdiction he needed to freeze their entire existence. I did not need to scream or threaten them to achieve this victory. I had simply let their own greed guide them directly into a dead-end alley, and then I quietly built a brick wall behind them. They were entirely trapped in a fortress of their own making, with the walls rapidly closing in. I pressed the button for my floor, the quiet hum of the elevator serving as a peaceful lullaby. Tomorrow, the legal meat grinder would begin, but tonight I was going to sleep better than I had in years. The silence that followed the collapse of their false empire lasted exactly 3 days. I knew from my decades in the construction industry that when a massive structure begins to fail under extreme pressure, it does not always go quietly. Sometimes the failing steel beams snap violently outward, sending deadly shrapnel in every direction. Rachel and Bradley were cornered. They had no access to the stolen money. Their social circle had abandoned them. They were facing an imminent commercial eviction from my house. But instead of feeling remorse or accepting the consequences of their greed, they chose to become dangerous. They decided to launch a desperate, malicious counterattack. It started with a sharp knock on the door of my downtown studio apartment on a Tuesday morning. I opened it to find a young man holding a thick stack of legal documents. He asked if I was Howard Mitchell. When I nodded, he shoved the papers into my hands and walked quickly down the hallway. I took the documents over to my small kitchen table and began to read. It was an emergency civil lawsuit and a formal petition for permanent medical conservatorship filed in the county court. Bradley and Rachel had managed to find a sleazy contingency lawyer willing to take their case on the promise of a massive future payout. I read through the allegations and felt a cold, dark realization settle over me. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of absolute fiction. Rachel was claiming under penalty of perjury that I was suffering from severe rapid-onset dementia, accompanied by violent paranoid delusions. The document stated that the $400,000 home equity line of credit was entirely my idea. They claimed I had begged them to take the money to expand Vanguard Logistics, and that Rachel had only signed the paperwork to help me manage the complex banking bureaucracy. They stated the $85,000 transfer was a deliberate gift I had given them for home renovations. Most absurdly, they claimed my sudden departure from the house and the appearance of Apex Financial Acquisitions were the chaotic actions of a mentally unstable man who was being manipulated by unseen scammers. They were asking a judge to declare me legally incompetent, invalidate the Apex Financial eviction, and grant Rachel total, permanent control over my physical person and my remaining financial estate. The sheer audacity of their lies was staggering, but it was not surprising. They were trying to construct an alternate reality to save themselves from prison. But as I continued reading the document, my chest began to feel unusually tight. It was a familiar sensation. I have managed a moderate heart condition for over a decade, taking a highly specific daily medication to keep my blood pressure and heart rhythm stabilized. Rachel knew all about my medical history. She used to accompany me to my cardiologist appointments before her mother passed away. I realized I only had a few pills left in my travel bottle. I put the lawsuit down, grabbed my car keys, and drove directly to the local pharmacy to refill my prescription. I walked up to the counter and handed my premium health insurance card to the pharmacist. He typed my information into his computer system. I waited patiently, expecting him to hand me the familiar white paper bag. Instead, he frowned and stared at his monitor. He typed my details in a second time, his frown deepening. He looked up at me with an apologetic expression. He told me that my prescription could not be filled through my insurance because the policy had been abruptly canceled. I stood there in the bright fluorescent light of the pharmacy, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. I asked him to check the termination date. He looked at the screen and confirmed that the policy was officially terminated 48 hours ago. He said the cancellation was authorized over the phone by my legal power of attorney. The puzzle pieces snapped together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Rachel had not just filed a frivolous lawsuit to save her husband. She had actively, maliciously canceled my life-saving health insurance. She knew that without coverage, my specialized heart medication would cost over $800 a month out of pocket. She knew she had just frozen my emergency funds. She assumed I was living on a fixed, limited income in a cheap apartment. She was intentionally trying to trigger a physical medical crisis. It was an act of calculated violence disguised as administrative paperwork. Rachel knew that if I could not afford my medication, my heart condition would rapidly deteriorate. If I suffered a cardiac event and ended up unconscious in a hospital bed, her fake lawsuit would instantly become a reality. The doctors would look at my failing health and assume I was exactly what she claimed, an incompetent, dying old man. She could walk into the intensive care unit, wave her forged power of attorney, and take absolute control of my life. She was willing to risk my actual death just to secure her financial future and keep her house. I looked at the pharmacist. I did not show an ounce of panic. I did not raise my voice or complain about my daughter. I calmly pulled out the new credit card Vincent had helped me secure through my offshore trust. I told the pharmacist I would pay the $800 out of pocket right now. He swiped the card, handed me my medication, and asked if I was going to be okay. I told him I was perfectly fine. I walked out of the pharmacy and sat in my car holding the small plastic bottle of pills. Any lingering shred of fatherly forgiveness, any small whisper of doubt I had been carrying in the back of my mind, completely evaporated. The woman who had canceled my heart medication was not my daughter anymore. She was a dangerous predator who needed to be permanently neutralized. I picked up my phone and called Vincent. He answered immediately. I told him exactly what Rachel had done. I told him about the emergency conservatorship lawsuit and the canceled health insurance. I could hear Vincent breathing heavily on the other end of the line, his professional composure cracking under the weight of pure outrage. He told me this was attempted manslaughter. He wanted to call the judge immediately and have them both arrested for reckless endangerment. I stopped him. I told Vincent to calm down. I explained that in structural engineering, when you want to prove a load-bearing column is defective, you do not just look at the cracks. You put it under maximum stress and record exactly how it breaks. Rachel and Bradley were breaking. They thought canceling my insurance and filing a fake lawsuit would terrorize me into submission. They did not realize they had just handed us the absolute final piece of evidence we needed. They had just proven to the court that their actions were not a misunderstanding. Their actions were actively malicious and physically dangerous. I told Vincent to accept the court summons. I told him not to fight the emergency hearing date. I wanted to look them in the eye in front of a judge. They were desperately trying to build a new fortress out of lies, but I already held the sledgehammer. I started the car and drove back to my apartment, ready for the final confrontation. The heavy brass handles of the county courthouse doors felt cold and absolute under my grip. I walked into the sprawling marble lobby with Vincent by my side, feeling no anxiety and no fear. The air inside the building was stale, smelling of floor wax old paper and the nervous sweat of desperate people. We made our way to the elevators and rode up to the 4th floor in complete silence. When we walked into the assigned courtroom, Rachel and Bradley were already seated at the plaintiff table. They had hired a man who looked exactly like the kind of attorney you hire when you are planning to lie under oath. He wore a suit that was a little too tailored, his watch was entirely too flashy, and his hair was slicked back with heavy gel. Rachel was dressed conservatively, wearing a modest gray dress, with her hair tied back in a simple knot. She wore minimal makeup, intentionally trying to look like the exhausted, heartbroken daughter, carrying the terrible burden of a sick parent. Bradley sat close beside her, holding her hand, offering quiet, reassuring pats on her shoulder. They looked over as I took my seat at the defense table. Rachel offered a pathetic little wave, a highly calculated gesture meant solely for the judge to see. I did not wave back. I did not frown or look away either. I just stared at her with the cold, analytical gaze of an engineer inspecting a condemned building. She shifted uncomfortably in her heavy wooden chair, breaking eye contact quickly and whispering something frantic to her attorney. The judge entered the room through a private, heavy wooden door. She was a stern-looking woman with iron gray hair, a sharp jawline, and a completely unreadable judicial expression. She called the emergency hearing to order, demanding absolute silence in her gallery, and immediately handed the floor to Rachel's attorney. The flashy man stood up, buttoned his jacket, and began weaving a masterpiece of absolute fiction. He spoke for 20 unbroken minutes, painting a tragic, desperate picture of my supposed mental decline. He told the judge that I was suffering from severe, rapid-onset dementia. He claimed I was having violent paranoid delusions, that my own family was trying to steal my assets. He confidently stated that the $400,000 home equity loan was entirely my idea, describing it as an aggressive business investment I had forcefully demanded Bradley make to secure the family legacy. He looked the judge in the eye and said, "Rachel only signed the bank paperwork because my hands were trembling too much to hold the pen." He even addressed the canceled premium health insurance, spinning that malicious act into a lie of medical necessity. He claimed they had to cancel my private policy to legally enroll me in a specialized state-run medical program meant exclusively for advanced dementia patients. Through it all, Rachel sat at the wooden table, quietly dabbing her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. She sniffled at all the right strategic moments. She looked exactly like a woman buckling under the tragic emotional weight of a father losing his mind. Bradley maintained a solemn expression, nodding slowly and sadly in agreement with every single lie his lawyer told. I sat perfectly still. I did not shake my head in disbelief. I did not scoff, sigh, or interrupt the proceedings. When someone is building a massive structure out of cheap materials, the worst thing you can do is shake the foundation early. You have to let them stack their lies as high as they possibly can. You have to let them commit entirely to the fraudulent architecture. The judge listened carefully to the painful story, taking copious notes on her yellow legal pad. Occasionally, she would look over her glasses at me, trying to assess my mental state from my physical posture. I gave her nothing but absolute calm restraint. Vincent sat next to me, writing quietly on his own notepad, completely unbothered by the opposing attorney's highly dramatic theatrical performance. We knew that the higher Rachel and Bradley built their tower of lies, the harder they were going to hit the concrete when we finally pulled the support columns out from under them. Finally, Rachel's attorney concluded his opening statement. He passionately asked the court to grant immediate permanent conservatorship over my person and invalidate the commercial eviction notice served by Apex Financial. He sat down looking incredibly pleased with his own performance. The judge turned her sharp attention to our table and asked Vincent if he had a response to these severe allegations. Vincent stood up slowly. He did not carry a thick stack of defensive paperwork. He did not look angry, flustered, or defensive. He simply walked over to the center of the courtroom, holding nothing but a small, silver, digital storage drive. He addressed the judge in a calm, measured, highly respectful tone. He stated that we would not be calling any medical experts to testify about my cognitive capacity. He stated that we would not be arguing about the canceled health insurance, the missing $85,000, or the tragic family dynamics. He told the judge that arguing with pure fiction is a fundamental waste of the court's valuable time. Instead, he requested formal permission to submit a single piece of physical evidence into the official court record. The judge granted the request, looking mildly intrigued by Vincent's absolute lack of panic. Vincent walked over to the court clerk and handed over the small silver drive. He asked the clerk to project the digital video file onto the large flat-screen monitor mounted on the wood-paneled wall of the courtroom. The room grew incredibly quiet. The only sound was the soft humming of the air conditioning vents as the screen flickered to life. The video was crystal clear, high-definition security footage taken directly from the interior security cameras of the First National Bank. The digital timestamp glowing in the bottom right corner displayed a date and time from exactly 3 months ago. The high angle provided a perfect, unobstructed view of Matthew Campbell's mahogany desk in the senior branch manager's private glass office. The judge leaned forward in her high leather chair, putting on her wire-rimmed reading glasses. Rachel's flashy attorney looked deeply confused, his confident smile faltering. Bradley suddenly stopped, holding Rachel's hand. The silent video showed Rachel walking into the bank office entirely alone. She was wearing a bright red designer coat and carrying a large, expensive leather handbag. She sat down in the chair opposite the desk, smiling warmly at the branch manager. The footage did not have audio, but the physical actions were completely undeniable. We all watched in absolute breathless silence as Rachel reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. It was the forged power of attorney document and the commercial home equity line of credit application. We watched her slide the documents across the polished wood. We watched Matthew review them, nodding his head. And then the camera zoomed in, perfectly capturing the exact moment Rachel picked up a heavy silver pen. She did not hesitate. Her hands were not trembling with grief. She did not look around for her sick father. She leaned over the desk with total confidence and deliberately, carefully signed my name on the bottom line of the massive loan agreement. Vincent let the video play for a few more damning seconds before asking the clerk to pause the footage directly on the glowing timestamp. The red digital numbers glared brightly in the dim courtroom lighting. Vincent turned away from the screen and looked directly up at the judge. He stated clearly that on the exact date and time displayed on that security monitor, Howard Mitchell was not experiencing a violent, paranoid delusion. He was not asking his daughter to help him sign complex financial documents because his hands were shaking from severe dementia. On that exact date and precise time, Howard Mitchell was attending a structural engineering symposium in Denver, Colorado, over 1,000 miles away from that bank. Vincent pulled a heavily sealed manila envelope from his inner suit pocket and handed it to the bailiff. He announced that the envelope contained my airline flight records, my hotel receipts, and time-stamped professional photographs of me speaking on a convention stage in Denver. Rachel was claiming under penalty of perjury that she had physically helped me sign the documents in my presence, but the cold, hard digital truth proved she was sitting in a bank completely alone, forging my signature to steal $500,000. The atmosphere in the courtroom shattered instantly. The towering house of cards did not just fall, it completely disintegrated into dust. Rachel's flashy attorney turned a sickening shade of pale, staring at the paused video screen with his mouth hanging slightly open. He slowly turned his head to look at his client, realizing with mounting horror that he had just staked his professional career and his legal license on a woman who lied to him about committing federal bank fraud. Rachel was no longer dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. She was frozen perfectly rigid in her chair, staring at her own face on the television monitor, her chest heaving with sudden, shallow, panicked breaths. Bradley looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. The judge slowly took off her reading glasses, placing them deliberately on her desk. The look of stern neutrality on her face was completely gone, replaced by a look of absolute, thunderous judicial fury. She had just sat through 20 minutes of calculated emotional manipulation, and she realized she had been used to facilitate a massive crime. The cold, hard facts had completely destroyed the fiction. The definitive confrontation was over, the truth was exposed, and I had not spoken a single word. The heavy silence in the courtroom felt absolute. The paused image of Rachel forging my signature remained glowing on the large monitor, a digital monument to her complete moral failure. The judge sat perfectly still for a long moment, letting the gravity of the perjury settle over the room. She slowly picked up her wooden gavel, but she did not strike it. She simply held it in her hand, looking down at Rachel and Bradley with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. When she finally spoke, her voice was dangerously low, vibrating with judicial authority. She addressed Rachel's flashy attorney first. She told him that in her 20 years on the bench, she had never witnessed such a brazen attempt to use the court system to facilitate a massive financial crime. She warned him that his legal license would be under immediate review by the State Bar Association. The attorney shrank down into his leather chair, looking physically sick, completely abandoning any attempt to defend his clients. The judge then turned her piercing gaze directly onto Rachel. She stated that this was no longer a simple civil dispute over a conservatorship or a commercial eviction. She declared that the video evidence clearly demonstrated multiple severe felonies, including federal bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and felony wire fraud. She explained that forging a signature on a federally backed $400,000 home equity line of credit carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. She told Rachel that she was legally obligated as an officer of the court to immediately forward the video file, the forged bank documents, and the transcript of this hearing directly to the district attorney and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The judge stated that Rachel was facing up to 20 years in federal prison for orchestrating this theft. The words federal prison echoed off the wood-paneled walls of the courtroom. They hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Rachel began to hyperventilate, her hands grasping at the collar of her modest gray dress, as if she were suddenly suffocating. She turned to Bradley, her eyes wide with absolute terror, seeking the quiet reassurance he had been providing just moments before. But Bradley was no longer looking at her with affection. The moment the judge uttered the words, federal prison, a profound transformation occurred at the plaintiff table. Bradley realized with terrifying clarity that the sinking ship he had been captaining was finally going under, and his wife was heavily chained to the anchor. He knew that the Federal Bureau of Investigation would freeze every single asset he had ever touched. He knew they would audit Vanguard Logistics and discover the stolen money. His arrogant self-preservation instincts violently hijacked his brain. He physically pulled his hand away from Rachel's grasp, pushing his heavy wooden chair back so hard it screeched against the polished floor. Bradley jumped to his feet, completely ignoring the frantic whispers of their paralyzed attorney. He looked frantically at the judge, holding his hands up in a gesture of desperate surrender. He began to speak rapidly, his voice cracking with panic. He swore under oath that he had absolutely no idea the documents were forged. He pointed a trembling finger directly at his own wife. He told the judge that Rachel handled all of the family finances and that she had lied to him. He claimed she told him I had willingly transferred the $400,000 as an early inheritance to save his logistics company. Bradley told the judge that he was an honest businessman who had been completely blindsided by a sociopathic spouse. He claimed he would never have accepted a single penny if he knew it was stolen from an elderly man. The hypocrisy was so thick, it was almost suffocating. This was the same man who had mocked me at Thanksgiving dinner, the same man who had ordered private security to throw me off my own property. Now he was standing in a court of law, weeping fake tears and claiming he loved his father-in-law and was completely horrified by his wife's actions. He asked the judge for immediate police protection, claiming he was suddenly terrified of what Rachel might be capable of doing to him. Rachel stared up at her husband in absolute shock. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll about to shatter. She could not comprehend what was happening. She had risked her entire life and committed federal crimes solely to fund his failing ambitions. She had kicked her own father out of his house to give Bradley's parents a place to live. She had sacrificed every moral boundary she possessed to be the perfect supportive partner to this man. And the absolute second his own freedom was threatened, he threw her directly into the path of a speeding train without a single ounce of hesitation. The shock paralyzing Rachel suddenly violently mutated into explosive rage. The modest, quiet daughter facade was completely ripped away. She leaped to her feet, knocking her chair backward onto the floor with a loud crash. She lunged toward Bradley, grabbing the lapels of his expensive, tailored suit. She screamed at the top of her lungs, completely ignoring the judge banging her gavel, demanding order. Rachel yelled that Bradley was a pathetic coward. She screamed that his company was a black hole of debt and that he had begged her for months to find a way to get my money. She told the entire courtroom that Bradley was the one who drove her to the bank that morning and waited in the parking lot while she forged the signature. She declared that he knew exactly where every single stolen dollar came from because he spent it all trying to pretend he was a successful businessman. She screamed that the $85,000 she transferred just 3 weeks ago was sitting entirely in his personal corporate account. She demanded the judge look at the bank records, proving he authorized the purchases of luxury furniture for his own parents using my stolen funds. They traded brutal, humiliating secrets, exposing every illegal and unethical thing they had done over the past 4 years. They confessed to tax evasion, hidden bank accounts, and corporate fraud right there in the open court, simply because they were so desperate to drag the other person down with them. She exposed his failing logistics company, his massive debts, and his complete lack of business acumen to the public record. She screamed that if she was going to a federal penitentiary, she was going to make absolutely sure he was in the cell right next to hers. The courtroom dissolved into absolute pathetic chaos. The bailiff had to physically step between them, pulling Rachel off of Bradley's suit while they continued to spit venom at each other. They were two drowning rats, viciously climbing over each other, trying to keep their heads above the rising water. Their united front was entirely decimated. The marriage they had paraded around as a symbol of their superiority was crumbling into toxic dust right in front of my eyes. They were destroying each other far more effectively than I ever could have with a lawsuit or an angry confrontation. I sat silently at the defense table next to Vincent, watching the spectacular collapse of their alliance. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the urge to intervene or gloat. I simply watched the inevitable mathematical consequence of building a life on a foundation of pure greed. When pressure is applied to a flawed structure, it always breaks at the weakest joint. Their marriage was nothing more than a transaction built on stolen money, and the moment the money turned into a federal liability, the transaction was violently canceled. The judge ordered the bailiff to separate them completely and formally suspended the civil hearing pending the immediate arrival of federal law enforcement. The decisive confrontation was over, and the antagonists had done all the heavy lifting for me. The courtroom was still ringing with the echoes of their vicious screaming. The bailiff had physically forced Rachel back into her heavy wooden chair, while Bradley stood panting on the other side of the room. Rachel was weeping openly now. Her shoulders shook violently, and tears streamed down her pale cheeks, ruining her carefully applied makeup. She looked exactly like a terrified, helpless little girl. I sat perfectly still at the defense table watching her cry. I studied the tears falling from her eyes. I knew exactly what kind of tears they were. They were not tears of remorse for stealing my life savings. They were not tears of guilt for trying to leave her elderly father homeless and without vital heart medication. They were the selfish, terrified tears of a cornered predator, realizing that her own trap had just snapped shut on her leg. Watching her weep in the harsh fluorescent light of the courtroom brought back a sudden, vivid memory of my late wife. Caroline was a woman of profound warmth and kindness, but she also possessed an incredibly sharp, piercing intuition. I had spent my entire life as an engineer learning how to analyze physical materials like steel and concrete. I understood how to build things to last. But Caroline was the one who truly understood people. She understood the hidden stress fractures in the human heart, and she had understood the fundamental structural flaws in our daughter far better than I ever did. I remembered a specific evening 15 years ago. Rachel had just graduated from college and had ruthlessly sabotaged a close friend to secure a highly competitive corporate internship. She had quietly stolen the girl's presentation notes and claimed the project entirely as her own. When the truth came out, Rachel did not show a single ounce of guilt. She simply stated that the corporate world was survival of the fittest. I had tried to defend her to Caroline. I had paced around our living room making excuses, calling it aggressive ambition and youthful ignorance. I desperately wanted to believe my daughter was just fiercely independent. Caroline had stopped me from pacing. She sat me down at the dining room table, the very same table where Bradley would later demand my house, and she looked at me with a deep, sorrowful knowing in her eyes. Carolyn told me that evening that Rachel lacked a fundamental human component. She told me our daughter did not experience empathy the way normal people did. She said Rachel viewed human relationships as simple accounting ledgers, measuring everyone strictly as either an asset or a liability. Caroline warned me with chilling accuracy that one day when we were old and no longer financially useful to her, Rachel would look at us and see nothing but an unnecessary burden. I had refused to believe my wife. I had become angry and accused Caroline of being too harsh on our only child. I had deliberately taken a thick blindfold, woven entirely from unconditional fatherly love, and tied it tightly over my own eyes. I refused to take it off for over a decade, because I refused to see the truth I had spent years reinforcing a defective structure. I had paid for Rachel's mistakes. I had funded Bradley's failing business ventures trying to buy my daughter's affection. I had allowed them to slowly chip away at my autonomy, always making excuses for her disrespect. I had always blamed Bradley for being the toxic influence desperately holding on to the grand illusion that my little girl was simply misguided by a bad husband. But sitting in the quiet aftermath of the courtroom explosion, watching Rachel viciously tear her husband apart to save her own skin, the thick blindfold finally burned away completely. I saw the cold, calculating predator Carolyn had warned me about all those years ago. Rachel had not hesitated for a single second to forge my signature on federal bank documents. She had not hesitated to drain my emergency checking account the morning I moved out. She had not hesitated to cancel my premium health insurance fully, knowing it could trigger a fatal cardiac event. She was exactly what her mother said she was. She was a woman completely devoid of a moral compass, willing to sacrifice her own father to maintain her lavish lifestyle. A profound, absolute stillness settled over my chest. The agonizing, heavy grief that had been gnawing at my heart since that terrible Thanksgiving dinner vanished entirely. The sting of betrayal dissolved. It was replaced by the cold, clear peace of a completed mathematical equation. The numbers had finally balanced. I looked at the woman sitting at the plaintiff table, and I did not feel the sudden instinctive urge to walk over and comfort her. I did not feel the desperate fatherly desire to beg the judge for leniency on her behalf. The biological tie between us had been permanently cleanly severed by her own malicious actions. She was no longer my little girl. She was simply a desperate criminal facing the severe real-world consequences of her own boundless greed. I turned my head away from her and looked straight ahead at the empty judicial bench. I had finally accepted the absolute truth. I had stopped being a victim the exact moment I stopped pretending she loved me. I sat in the small, windowless conference room on the third floor of the federal building. The walls were painted a dull, institutional beige. Vincent sat beside me, organizing a few remaining documents into a neat stack. The air was heavy and smelled of strong coffee and antiseptic floor cleaner. It had been exactly 4 days since the courtroom implosion. The wheels of federal justice turn incredibly slowly until they are handed a perfectly packaged case of wire fraud with crystal-clear video evidence. Then they move with terrifying speed. We were waiting for Rachel. Her newly appointed public defender had begged Vincent for a private mediation session before the federal prosecutor formally filed the grand jury indictment. I agreed to the meeting not out of pity, but because a structural demolition requires a final inspection to ensure the site is completely leveled. Over the past 96 hours, the false empire Vanguard Logistics had completely collapsed into a pile of worthless rubble. Vincent had kept me updated on the rapid sequence of events. The moment the judge suspended our civil hearing, the federal agents moved in. They executed a massive search warrant on Bradley's corporate office. They seized every computer, every server, and every paper ledger. Because the stolen $400,000 had been thoroughly mixed with his daily operating funds, the government froze the entire corporate entity. Bradley was locked out of his own building. He could not pay his employees. He could not pay his shipping vendors. The investors who had attended the lavish party at my house ran for the hills, taking their capital with them. Bradley was currently sitting in a cheap motel room, desperately trying to find a criminal lawyer who would work for free. But the most satisfying update came from the county sheriff department. The emergency commercial eviction notice filed by Apex Financial Acquisitions had not been paused by the federal investigation. Exactly 72 hours after the process servers crashed, the party, 2 armed sheriff deputies arrived at my front door. Bradley's parents, Patricia and her husband, were still inside, refusing to leave. They had locked the doors and tried to claim squatters' rights. The deputies did not care about their entitlement. They breached the front door and physically escorted Patricia off the property. She was forced to stand on the public sidewalk, clutching a single plastic trash bag of her belongings, while a county locksmith changed every single lock on the house. She was not wearing Caroline's vintage emerald necklace anymore. It had been confiscated as stolen property. They were completely homeless, relying on the charity of distant relatives just to find a place to sleep. The heavy metal door of the conference room clicked open, breaking my train of thought. Rachel walked in, followed closely by an exhausted-looking public defender. The woman who sat down across from me was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant socialite pouring champagne just a week ago. She was wearing a faded gray sweatsuit. Her hair was greasy and pulled back into a messy knot. Her face was gaunt, the skin under her eyes bruised with deep purple bags from days without sleep. She had spent the last 4 nights in a county holding cell, while the federal prosecutors organized her transfer. The harsh reality of a concrete floor and a metal toilet had completely stripped away her entitlement. She looked down at the scratched wooden table, her hands trembling violently in her lap. Rachel's attorney cleared his throat and began to speak. But Rachel raised a shaking hand to stop him. She looked up at me. Her eyes were red and swollen. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking into a pathetic sob. "Please, you have to stop this. I am begging you. They are offering me a plea deal for 10 years. 10 years in a federal penitentiary. I will not survive in there. You know I cannot survive in a place like that." She leaned forward, tears spilling down her cheeks and dripping onto the wooden table. She told me that Bradley had completely abandoned her. She said he filed for a rapid divorce and was actively cooperating with the federal prosecutors offering to testify against her in exchange for his own immunity. He had thrown her entirely to the wolves to save his own skin, just as I knew he would. I listened to her weep. I listened to her describe the utter devastation of her life. She was facing a decade surrounded by concrete walls and razor wire. She had lost her husband, her wealth, her social standing, and her freedom in a matter of days. "I am so sorry, Dad," she choked out, gasping for air. "I was stupid. I was greedy. Bradley manipulated me into doing it. Please tell the prosecutor you forgive me. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. You are the only one who can save me." I looked at the tears streaming down her face. I looked at the trembling hands that had confidently forged my name to a fraudulent loan. She was completely broken. The weight of her own actions had crushed her into a fine dust. I did not reach across the table to hold her hand. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my voice entirely level. "You are not sorry that you stole my life savings, Rachel," I said calmly. "You are not sorry that you tried to leave me homeless. You are not sorry that you canceled the heart medication that keeps me alive. You are only sorry that you got caught. You are only crying because the man you committed these crimes for decided you were no longer a useful asset. You looked at me like an expired resource that needed to be discarded. Now the federal government is looking at you the exact same way. You built this prison cell all by yourself. I just locked the door." I sat in the heavy silence of the conference room watching my words sink into Rachel. The public defender shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearing his throat in an attempt to regain control of the narrative. He started to speak using legal jargon about mitigating circumstances and first-time offenses, but I raised my hand and stopped him mid-sentence. I told the lawyer that I did not come to this federal building to listen to a defense strategy. I told him I came to offer a structural recalculation. I looked back at Rachel, who was staring at me with wide, desperate eyes. I told her that the federal prosecutor had a flawless case against her. They had the security video, they had the forged documents, and they had a highly motivated victim willing to testify. I explained that if I took the stand, she would absolutely receive the maximum sentence. However, I also knew that the federal justice system was heavily burdened. I told her that if the primary victim suddenly submitted a sworn affidavit of non-prosecution and legally refused to authenticate the financial records, the prosecutor's flawless case would become incredibly complicated and expensive to pursue. I told Rachel I possessed the power to make the federal charges disappear entirely. Rachel let out a sharp gasp of relief. She reached her trembling hands across the scratched wooden table, her eyes flooding with a sudden pathetic hope. "Oh, thank you, Dad," she sobbed, leaning forward as if she were about to stand up and hug me. "Thank you so much. I swear I will pay you back every single penny. I will get a job. I will make this right." I did not move my hands from my lap. I stared at her with a gaze so cold, it completely froze her desperate display of affection. I told her to sit back down. I told her I was not doing this out of love, and I was certainly not doing this out of forgiveness. I explained that sending her to a federal penitentiary would require me to spend the next 2 years attending criminal hearings, sitting through depositions, and listening to lawyers argue about my personal life. I told her that my time and my peace of mind were far too valuable to waste on a woman who tried to destroy me. I wanted her out of my life immediately and permanently. I nodded to Vincent, who was sitting quietly beside me. Vincent unlatched his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out 3 thick stacks of legally binding documents. He placed them in a neat, precise row directly in front of Rachel. He handed her a heavy silver pen. It was the exact same brand of pen she had used to forge my signature at the bank. Rachel stared down at the documents, her temporary relief instantly evaporating into a new, terrifying realization. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, speaking in a low, absolute tone. I told her that I would sign the affidavit to drop the criminal charges only if she signed every single page sitting in front of her. I told her there was absolutely no room for negotiation. She would sign the papers exactly as they were written, or Vincent would pack them back into his briefcase, and we would walk out the door, leaving her to the federal prosecutor. I pointed to the first stack of papers. I explained that it was a comprehensive, irrevocable relinquishment of any and all future inheritance rights. I told Rachel that by signing those pages, she was legally severing herself from my estate forever. She would not receive a single penny when I died. She would not receive a piece of jewelry, a piece of furniture, or a single photograph. I told her that my entire fortune, the money her mother and I had spent decades building, was being transferred entirely to a charitable foundation. I wanted her to understand that she had permanently gambled away her future for a failing logistics company, and she had lost everything. I moved my finger to the second stack of documents. I told her it was a quitclaim deed and a full waiver of any marital or familial claim to my residential property. She was legally returning the house entirely to my offshore trust, completely unencumbered by any debt she or Bradley had attempted to attach to it. I told her that she was accepting full, absolute financial liability for the ruined Vanguard logistics accounts. She would walk out of this federal building with no home, no car, and no access to the wealthy social circles she had desperately tried to impress. She was going to be completely destitute, starting her life over from absolute zero, with the massive weight of a collapsed business chained to her name. Finally, I pointed to the third and most important document. I told her it was a voluntary, permanent restraining order. I explained the terms with brutal clarity. She was legally barred from ever contacting me again. She could not call my phone. She could not send me an email or a letter. If I was ever hospitalized, she was not allowed to visit me. When I eventually passed away, she was legally prohibited from attending my funeral. I told her that as far as I was concerned, the daughter I raised died the moment she walked into that bank and forged my name. I was simply burying the memory of her today. If she ever violated the restraining order, the legal agreement would trigger an immediate civil penalty that would bankrupt her for the rest of her natural life. The public defender picked up the documents and scanned through the pages, his eyes widening at the absolute ruthlessness of the terms. He leaned over to Rachel and whispered frantically in her ear. He told her that these documents stripped her of every single legal right she possessed as a family member. He told her she would be leaving with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. Rachel looked at the lawyer, and then she looked at me. Her face was a mask of pure devastation. She realized she was choosing between 10 years in a concrete cell or a lifetime of complete, absolute poverty and isolation. She looked down at the heavy silver pen resting on top of the contracts. Her hand trembled violently as she reached out and picked it up. She did not cry anymore. The tears had completely dried up, replaced by the hollow, empty stare of a person who had finally been crushed under the weight of their own consequences. She pressed the tip of the pen to the paper. I sat in perfect silence, watching her sign her own name this time. I watched her initial every single page, legally dismantling her own life with the exact same motion she had used to try and dismantle mine. The scratching sound of the pen against the thick paper echoed loudly in the small room. It was the sound of order being restored. It was the sound of a toxic foundation being completely, cleanly removed from my property. When she finished the final page, she dropped the pen. It clattered against the wooden table. She did not look up at me. She simply stared down at her hands, completely broken and entirely defeated. Vincent quietly gathered the signed documents, checked every signature for accuracy, and placed them carefully back into his leather briefcase. The lock snapped shut with a sharp, final click. I stood up from my chair and adjusted my wool suit. I did not say goodbye. I did not wish her luck. I turned my back on the woman who used to be my daughter and walked toward the heavy metal door. Vincent followed closely behind me. We walked out of the conference room, leaving Rachel sitting entirely alone in the dull beige room. I walked down the long corridor of the federal building, feeling a profound, immense weight lifting off my shoulders with every single step. The smoldering conflict was over. The explosive catalyst had been contained. The financial trap had sprung perfectly. I had lost my only child, but I had reclaimed my dignity, my legacy, and my absolute total control. I walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight, breathing in the fresh, clean air, ready to finally begin the rest of my life. I had the quitclaim deed back in my possession, but I had no intention of ever walking through those heavy oak doors again. The sprawling brick colonial I had built for Caroline was no longer a sanctuary. It had been thoroughly infected by the arrogance and greed of the people who tried to steal it. The polished marble floors they had installed over my antique rugs and the sterile gray paint they had slapped over the walls were physical scars of a massive betrayal. A house is just a structure made of wood and concrete. It only becomes a home when it is filled with respect and love. I realized that keeping the property would only anchor me to the painful memory of my own blindness. As an engineer, I knew that sometimes a foundation is so deeply compromised by toxic materials that no amount of renovation can save it. The only logical solution is to clear the site completely and start over. I did not call a residential real estate agent to list the property on the open market. I did not want to sell the house to another family who might unknowingly inherit the bad energy of that space. Instead, I called a major commercial developer I had worked with decades ago during my corporate career. The neighborhood had expanded rapidly over the last 30 years, and my large corner lot was now prime real estate for high-density luxury condominiums. The developer was absolutely thrilled to acquire the land. We closed the sale in less than 2 weeks. I did not haggle over the price. I accepted a cash offer of $3.5 million on the strict condition that the existing structure be completely demolished within 30 days. The developer found the clause highly unusual, but he eagerly agreed to the terms. I wanted the physical manifestation of my past mistakes wiped off the face of the earth. 3 weeks later, I stood on the exact same spot on the public sidewalk where Bradley had ordered his private security guards to escort me off the property. It was a crisp, bright Tuesday morning. The massive floodlights from their lavish party were gone. The long line of luxury valet cars was replaced by a fleet of heavy yellow construction equipment. I watched as a massive excavator rolled onto the manicured front lawn, its heavy metal tracks tearing deep permanent grooves into the perfect green grass. The demolition crew had already spent the previous day stripping the interior of any salvageable materials. The house stood completely hollow, waiting for its final adjustment. I felt a profound sense of anticipation building in my chest. I was not mourning the loss of the building. I was celebrating the final step of a perfectly executed structural correction. The heavy machinery operator positioned the massive steel bucket of the excavator directly against the front porch. With a loud, deafening roar of the diesel engine, the hydraulic arm pushed forward. The thick wooden columns that had supported the roof for 3 decades snapped like dry, brittle twigs. The front awning collapsed in a massive, billowing cloud of dust and splintered wood. I watched the machine systematically tear through the grand foyer, ripping down the sterile gray walls Rachel had chosen. The steel teeth bit fiercely into the dining room, where that terrible Thanksgiving dinner had taken place, completely obliterating the exact spot where Bradley had arrogantly demanded my submission. The heavy mechanical arm swung wide and crushed the bay windows of the living room, where Patricia had stood wearing my wife's stolen jewelry. The bedroom by the laundry area where they had planned to banish me was crushed into a flattened pile of drywall and shattered glass. Every single room that held a memory of their disrespect was violently and permanently erased. The noise of the breaking timber and falling brick was absolutely deafening, but to my ears it sounded like a perfect symphony. It was the sound of a slate being wiped completely clean. Several neighbors stood on their front porches watching the sudden destruction in shock, but I simply stood there with my hands in my pockets, feeling incredibly light. The heavy anchor of the past was finally gone. By noon, the entire sprawling colonial house was nothing but a flat pile of rubble waiting to be hauled away by heavy dump trucks. The fortress of their entitlement had been completely leveled. Gravity and heavy machinery had done exactly what I commanded them to do. I walked away from the empty lot and drove directly to the bank. I took the $3.5 million from the commercial land sale and transferred every single penny into the newly established Caroline Mitchell Memorial Engineering Trust. I sat down with Vincent later that afternoon to design the exact legal parameters of the scholarship program. The money would provide full university tuition, housing, and living expenses for brilliant, underprivileged students pursuing degrees in structural engineering. I wanted to find young men and women who possessed the exact opposite character traits of my former daughter. I wanted to invest my resources in people who truly understood the value of hard work. I wanted to help students who respected the foundations built by the generations before them and who possessed a genuine moral compass. As we finalized the trust documents, I imagined reading the future application essays of kids who worked 2 jobs just to afford textbooks. I imagined the relief they would feel when they realized their education was fully funded. I had taken the physical manifestation of my biggest failure and mathematically converted it into a machine that generated bright futures. The massive wealth that Rachel and Bradley tried to steal to fund a life of lazy luxury was now going to build bridges, hospitals, and schools through the capable hands of deserving students. I had completely neutralized the poison they injected into my life and synthesized it into a permanent cure. The financial and emotional ledger was finally perfectly balanced. The morning sun rises slowly over the calm surface of the lake, casting a warm golden light across the wooden deck of my cabin. The air is crisp, smelling heavily of pine needles and fresh water. I sit in a sturdy cedar chair holding a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. Vincent sits across from me baiting a fishing hook with the slow, methodical patience of a man who has nowhere else to be. We are not discussing court dates or legal injunctions anymore. We are discussing the weather and the migration patterns of local birds. This cabin only has 2 bedrooms and a single stone fireplace. It does not have a grand marble foyer or a massive dining room. It is small and quiet, but it is entirely mine. The foundation is poured perfectly straight directly onto solid bedrock. It is a home built for peace, not for showing off to strangers. It has been 6 months since I watched the bulldozers erase my past. Vincent still brings me the occasional update from the city, not because I ask for them, but because he likes to ensure the legal ledgers remain permanently closed. He mentioned casually this morning that Bradley is currently working as a night shift dispatcher for a regional trucking company. His wages are heavily garnished to pay off his massive corporate bankruptcy. Rachel is living in a tiny rented room in an industrial neighborhood, working checkout at a discount grocery store. They are officially divorced. Their grand, unbreakable alliance lasted exactly as long as my stolen money did. The absolute second the stolen cash disappeared, their loyalty instantly evaporated into thin air. People often assume that I must carry a heavy bleeding hole in my heart after losing my only child. They think a father must be consumed by grief when his family falls apart. But as I look out at the quiet water, I do not feel empty at all. I feel incredibly light. The woman I lost was not my daughter. She was a dangerous parasite perfectly disguised by a shared last name. Society conditions us to believe we must endure endless abuse simply because someone shares our bloodline. I refuse to accept that deeply flawed logic. Respect is the only true foundation of a family. Without mutual respect and genuine care, blood is nothing more than a meaningless biological coincidence. I did not lose a family member. I successfully removed a toxic threat from my environment. My real legacy is currently sitting in university classrooms across the state. The Engineering Scholarship Trust has already fully funded its first 4 students. 2 young women and 2 young men who have known nothing but difficult physical labor their entire lives are now studying the physics of load-bearing walls. They write me handwritten letters every single month updating me on their midterm grades and their structural design projects. They call me Mr. Mitchell, with genuine profound gratitude in their written words. I have found more authentic family in those 4 strangers than I ever found in the daughter I raised. Caroline would be incredibly proud of the work we are doing. The wealth we spent decades accumulating is finally doing exactly what it was meant to do. It is building strong, lasting futures for people who actually deserve them. I take a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest. Vincent packs up his tackle box and heads down to the wooden dock to cast his line into the deep water. I will stay right here on the porch. If there is one singular truth I have learned from 71 years on this earth and 40 years as a structural engineer, it is this: you do not need to scream to be heard. You do not need to throw violent punches to win a battle against toxic people. True justice is an entirely silent mathematical process. When greedy, arrogant people try to build their extravagant lives on top of your sacrifices, you do not need to tear them down with your own hands. You simply step out from underneath them. You calmly remove your financial and emotional support, and you quietly walk away. Gravity is a completely impartial force. If their foundation is rotten, you just let the crushing weight of their own actions bring the entire building down on their heads. Did you find value in my story today? Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace and dignity? Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so I can keep sharing these important life lessons. Thank you so much for your sweet support, and remember to always protect your foundation. See you in the next life story.